The effects and aftermath of the Vietnam War are still present, even in our modern times. It was a war that stretched from the early 1950s to its end in 1975, that arose and entwined itself with the issues of the Cold War and fear of communism. This was a hard time for the American people. Boys were sent out to fight at a young age to come face to face with the brutalities of war. There was also a split of opinions about whether or not America should even involve itself in the war. Some may remember the powerful scenes depicted in the Oscar award-winning movie Forrest Gump, starring Tom Hanks, that gives a soldier's childlike, innocent view of these hardships, from simple environmental problems to bombs, amputations, and post-traumatic stress. The author, Tim O'Brien, however, was a soldier himself in the Vietnam War, and his perspective opposes Forrest Gump's on many different levels. In his work, The Things I Carried, a collection of short stories based on his personal experiences in the war, witnessing some of the thousands U.S. troops and Vietnamese citizens killed. In fact, it has been speculated that O'Brien wrote this historic collection of short stories due to his intolerance of his peers' ignorance and an understanding just how different and cruel a world of war is. Jim O'Brien, born in 1946, grew up in Minnesota, and though he never considered himself a spokesman for the war, he still detailed that his town growing up was, quote, a town that congratulates itself day after day on its own ignorance of the world, a town that got us into Vietnam, end quote. He had only spent a year in combat, but that doesn't mean his experiences are invalid. Just a year in the war force gave him the conscience he needed to create the lifelike environment displayed in The Things They Carried. These stories dwell in a dangerous and powerful territory between fact and fiction, that unless the reader had been present with O'Brien, they would not be able to tell the difference between the two. O'Brien masterfully creates this blurred distinction, so that unlike a history textbook that lists off facts, the emotion and the heart would be present and move its readers. It is easy to come to the conclusion that O'Brien wrote this work to give an honest perspective of the foot soldier's experience in the war, because there is nearly nothing political suggested in the stories, despite his studies in political science in the late 1960s. Just semi-autobiographical accounts of what vicious experiences the soldiers who fought in the war faced. O'Brien, as stated briefly before, had an intolerance for ignorance, but also for America's prideful view of itself, saying in reference to America's search of the U.S. MIAs, quote, a perverse and outrageous double standard. What if things were reversed? What if the Vietnamese were to ask us, or to require us to locate and identify each of their own MIAs? Numbers alone would make it impossible. 100,000 is a conservative estimate, maybe double that, maybe triple. From my own sliver of experience, 1 year at war, one pair of eyes, I can testify to the lasting anonymity of a great many Vietnamese dead, end quote. The Things They Carried is powerful to its readers, not just because O'Brien's use of fictional reality, but also because of the poetic nature it is written in. The title has a double meaning. The characters list off the many things they physically carried in the war, including their weight and bulk, but it also has a meaning of what the soldiers carried emotionally and mentally. The main character, Lieutenant Cross, carries with him a distraction and longing to go back home for a girl. But when a soldier in his platoon is killed, he blames his distractions and carries with him the weight of that burden of feeling responsible. Last but not least, these stories were published nearly 20 years after the war had finished in 1990. Even though O'Brien had published works about the war soon after America had left in 1973, I believe this is the most important. That is because sometimes when a topic is not discussed for many years, we can sometimes forget how serious and real it was when it was happening. By publishing nearly 20 years later, O'Brien is bringing up the subject again just so we don't forget, and we'll never forget, how tough the Vietnam War was. And even though for us it was published nearly 30 years ago, we need to remember that we should not remain ignorant as his hometown was. Otherwise, we might too forget and make the same mistake.